From the Toronto Star, I'm Saba Eitizaz, and this matters. If you're a working Canadian, the chances are that your retirement investments are going into at least one of the country's Big 8 funds. But do you know where your money is actually going? Chances are, like most Canadians, you have no idea how the country's big pension funds are investing your money. Now a report is revealing that multiple federal and provincial funds in Canada are investing in Chinese companies complicit in human rights abuses. Pension funds of several other Western countries have done the same. They've invested in companies involved in a Chinese government labor transfer program, accused of subjecting the country's persecuted Uyghur minority to forced labor and internment. At least one major Canadian pension fund mentioned in the report has rejected these allegations. Joanna Chu and Jeremy Nuttall covered this for The Star. Jeremy joins me now for more. Hi, Jeremy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, a report by the human rights organization Hong Kong Watch has found that federal and provincial pension funds are investing in Chinese companies that might be complicit in human rights abuses. Can you tell me a little bit more about what stood out to you in this report?
Yeah, well, Hong Kong Watch, which is a UK-based organization, went through the pension funds of numerous countries, some public, some private, but just major pension funds. But what they found is related to these Morgan Stanley index funds, three particular index funds that all have companies in them that have been named in either media reports or a U.S. sanctions list for having human rights violations or labor violations in their supply chain, specifically related to the construction of internment camps for Uyghur people in Xinjiang, the Xinjiang region in China, or using forced labor via the Chinese government's labor transfer program, which has been used to take Uyghurs out of Xinjiang and move them all across China.
Yeah.
Now, China has been saying for years that this is a vocational training program. But of course, the Uyghurs who have come out of it and managed to get out of China have said, no, this is forced labor. And they've talked about just atrocious human rights violations, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, people being held against their will, people being forced to work without pay, all over the map. And it's well documented. Yet, according to this Hong Kong Watch report, major funds like Morgan Stanley are still investing in some of these companies.
So help me connect the dots here a little bit. How is a pension plan here in Canada connected to China through this sort of nexus?
Yeah, well, I should preface this with the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board says that they are not invested in any of these, despite the Hong Kong Watch report. Hong Kong Watch stands by its reportings. But what they're saying is that the CPP, as well as an RBC pension plan and a few other, Canadian pension plans, are invested in these Morgan Stanley index funds. And it's really just sort of that simple, according to the Hong Kong Watch report. So essentially, Canadian pension plans would have money invested in the Morgan Stanley index funds, and they would get returns out of those funds.
Let's take a step back. A United Nations report over the summer accused China of serious human rights violations in Xinjiang, but this has been reported multiple times. And like you mentioned, Uyghurs who have managed to escape have had multiple accounts of what's going on there. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's been happening?
Yeah, the main thing was, around 2016, 2017, China started establishing these camps and basically finding excuses, if not just outright taking, at first, young men from Xinjiang and putting them in these camps for indoctrination. And eventually that spread to women. Eventually, children were taken from their parents to live in these camps. And particularly the women who have been in these camps have talked about rapes, sexual abuse from guards, malnourishment. And the men have talked about being beaten and tortured, being forced to confess things. There was one woman who, in front of the Canadian Parliamentary Committee investigating this, she was actually from, I believe it was Kazakhstan, and she was ethnically a Uyghur, and she happened to be visiting in China for business, and she was just taken and thrown in one of these camps, a Kazakh national. And she talked about being forced to confess that she was somehow involved in terrorist activities. And this kind of stuff has been coming out for a few years now. And China has denied human rights abuses, but they haven't denied the existence of the camps. And the interesting thing about the UN report when it came out, though, is it came out, I believe it was 10 minutes before the woman who was responsible for conducting it was due to resign her post at the UN, which, of course, led people to speculate that she had been basically forced to withhold it because it made China look so bad. So, overall, this whole thing has been a very ugly situation.
And that's, I think, around 2021 when Canada's Parliament also declared it a genocide, right?
Yeah, in February 2021, the Canadian Parliament declared it a genocide. Members of the government abstained because if they had voted for it, it then sort of becomes an official government position, which Trudeau is not interested in making at this point because there are legal ramifications for that. Canada has a Genocide Prevention Act, I believe that's what it's called off the top of my head, which would require us to take certain measures after that. And so, basically, aside from hand-wringing, and some other parliaments around the world declaring it a genocide, China's pretty much getting away with it.
And as you mentioned earlier, Beijing has not really denied the existence of internment camps, but insists that they're being used for vocational training and not human rights abuses, right?
Yeah. And, for that, they've taken people from Xinjiang, which is, again, far western region, and they've taken them to the other side of the country and put them in factories. And in those factories, there, some complaint of not being paid fair wages or being paid at all. And of course, they're in the middle of a part of the country where they don't have relatives, they don't have a support network, and they're kind of stuck in these factories once they're in that situation.
Okay, so let's come back to this recent report. Did it also break down specifically which pension funds might be doing this, might be working with some of these companies?
Yeah, in Canada, the CPP was named, RBC's pension plan was named. There was the Manitoba Public Pension Fund, as well as the CSSB, which is a Manitoba Public Pension Fund, was one of the ones that was named. The BCI, which is the BC Investment Corporation, a public pension fund there. By public, I mean like Public Workers Pension Fund. I believe that the similar fund in Alberta was also named in it. So it was, right across the board. I think at the end of the day, there was about 9 to 10 Canadian pension funds that were invested.
And what was the response when there was an effort to reach out to these companies? Was it pretty much uniform or?
Yeah, the Manitoba Pension Fund, they said they couldn't comment until they see the report, which is reasonable. The Canada Pension Plan Investment Board denied or rejected, I should say, the findings and said that they are not invested in it. And the RBC, they got back to me, asked a few questions, but I never got a follow-up answer from them. A couple other ones didn't answer the request for comment to begin with.
We'll be right back. There's been a lot of reporting around this recently, and also about just the fact that, a lot of these funds, there's not much transparency in figuring out where the investments go. Did the report make any recommendations on this front? Like, how do we address an issue like this?
Yeah, well, obviously, one of the things they want is for companies to pull out and do a better job of vetting their stock portfolios. The Canada Pension Plan claims they have a very rigorous process for this kind of vetting. And I think that's sort of the main thing that Hong Kong Watch would like, is for companies to stop passively, as they put it, passively investing in these funds and actually think about the morality of this.
So why is this not as simple as a pension company identifying a problematic practice and simply stopping? Why there's so much complexity?
Yeah, there's money at stake, right? And that obviously makes it harder and harder for them. They want returns. They know that Canadian pension plan holders want returns on their pensions. And it's also hard for companies to get in and get honest appraisals of what's going on with these companies in China. In reports I've done in the past, not related to this report, I've talked to companies about somebody in their supply chain that has been accused of maybe using forced labor for cotton manufacturing, et cetera. And they're always like, oh, well, we've gone and looked at ourselves, or we hired this third party to do an audit. And then you find out that, this third party is also often employed by the company that's been accused of using forced labor. And because China is not an open and transparent government, it's hard for investigators to get in and do honest appraisals. This is another issue, is that, why are we investing so fulsomely when we can't have access to these companies in these parts of the world to see for ourselves what's going on?
So can the government step in and play a role here? Should they be doing that?
Yeah, the government certainly could, but the Canadian government continually hides from these issues. On the forced labor issue, especially, there's a bill through the House of Commons where two senators are trying to get a Forced Labor Prevention Act passed, which would prevent more actual products from coming into Canada that are suspected to be in forced labor. But, in the past, we've approached the Canadian Border Services to ask, what are you doing to prevent this from getting into the country? And I remember it was last year, it might be more now, but it was last year, they had said that they had stopped a total of one company from bringing in goods that were suspected to be made of forced labor, just one. Meanwhile, this happens all in the United States often. They are stopping products. They have lists of sanctioned companies and things that can't bring in products made from forced labor. They have legislation going back 100 years to prevent products made from forced labor from coming into the United States. Yet here in Canada, it's just, again, a shrug of the shoulders and, oh, well, it's quite typical of the direction this country has been heading in for some time.
And I know that Foreign Affairs critic and Conservative MP Michael Chong has been talking about this quite vocally and about the government of China. Can you tell me a little bit about what he's been saying?
Yeah, Michael Chong's been very outspoken, bright light on this issue. He's been wanting Canada to get tougher on China in general, but he's also been really pushing hard for better enforcement of our laws when it comes to preventing forced labor products from coming into the country and from investing Canadian pension plans in questionable companies. Him and there's a few others. There's been Michael Chong and John McKay, who's a Liberal. Of course, Julie Milleville-Duchesne, Senator. There are a few bright lights. Chong's definitely one of them.
So there are some conversations happening. So, Jeremy, at this point, we've reported a lot about how there's a lot we don't know about what our pension funds are invested in outside of what's invested in China. There's been reports that some are maybe being invested in industries and companies that fuel the climate crisis, for instance. Is the lack of transparency in where these investments go a part of the problem?
I think so. The lack of transparency is definitely an issue because it's hard for anybody to make a cogent argument against investing in something unless they know exactly what's going on. And this is where we need to have a better, especially on something like the CPP. They are public. You can go in, you can see their figures and their numbers. But when it comes to due diligence of companies they are invested in, I think that we need to have better access and transparency.
And is there anything that we as investors can do to take action? ESG, I've heard, is the answer. If you can talk a little bit about that.
It's quite difficult with the public pensions because they're so large. Mm-hmm. They're so big and they're these huge massive machines, and people have made demands to divest from oil, et cetera, as you know, in the past. And they just seem to get away with ignoring it, So it's almost like you're going to need, I guess, politicians or some kind of a campaign to sort of take the lead on these issues and force divestment or a change in how we do things.
But isn't ethical investing sort of a trend that is growing in popularity, and are the ways to do that being explored?
Well, I'm not super pro on the investment culture. I just sort of, when it involves these things, I have to look into it. But
yeah,
I mean, I would say that it gets talked about a lot, but how often it's actually happening is something I can't answer. But call me cynical, but I think that it's probably just a lot of talk as usual.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for your insight and for your reporting on this. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I was talking to Star reporter Jeremy Nuttall. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Saba Eitizaz. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.